Hi folks, Florida Man here, and today I'm bringing you a conversation between myself and Brother Board. That's right, another diplomacy social media personality, and he has a lot to share about how his experiences with gunboat diplomacy have helped him to learn more about press diplomacy, and also a lot of deep thoughts about press diplomacy and gaming in general. So please listen and enjoy. Good afternoon, Blake, also known as Brother Board for those watching. I understand that you are an expert in gunboat diplomacy, as well as a popular diplomacy social media personality. So I am interviewing you to find out about how one does well at gunboat diplomacy, and also how that can interrelate and help you be better at press diplomacy.
All right, I am champing at the bit. This is my favorite topic in all of gaming, probably. So, gunboat diplomacy is a variant of diplomacy where the players may not communicate in words. Some potential players might have an understanding that they don't communicate at all, but that's not true. Gunboat diplomacy allows the players to communicate, but only through their moves. And so it's a very interesting kind of game to play, since you have to understand another person's intentions and maybe try to work with them, even become allies or friends a little bit, figure those things out just from how people move pieces around on a map. And that's possible to do. It is possible to communicate. It is possible to understand another person. And for this reason, I played it a lot. I've played gunboat diplomacy probably more than 100 matches over 10 years, maybe much more. I don't know. They're not all recorded or written down somewhere. And I've gotten quite good. I've gotten successful. I spent a lot of time trying to get better at the variant. There's not a lot out there on the subject, even though gunboat diplomacy for online play is pretty popular. Like, there's a lot of people who play it, and you can get matches pretty easily, since the time commitment is not the same as press diplomacy. Mm-hmm. And it's more attractive to beginners because it's less intimidating to not have to send messages and so on. Even though it's so popular, there's not a lot of stuff that's been written about it. And so I had to get good on my own for the most part. And I taught a lot of players how to play, who I wanted to play with, people who were interested in playing gunboat diplomacy but didn't really know where to begin. And that those efforts that I made to teach them how to play eventually gave rise to most of the content on my blog, where I had written things or drawn diagrams for my friends that they said, really, like, anybody would benefit from this. And over time, over a couple of years, I've written quite a lot now about gunboat diplomacy. And the main thing at the beginning to understand is to think about the human being who's behind the pieces. In press diplomacy, you're always thinking like this because there's somebody who you're talking to, and their humanity is available at all times, pretty much, as long as they keep writing. In gunboat diplomacy, a lot of beginners think of the pieces almost like they're robots or something, like that there's not a human who's making a decision, or that the pieces are just kind of moving randomly around. And as I've gotten good at gunboat diplomacy, I find myself thinking things like, okay, I've seen this guy chicken out of taking a risk 3 times before, so basically this person's a kind of a coward, and so I don't think they're going to take a risk this time. And so if they're not going to take a risk, that means that logically they're going to move this army to Serbia because that's the least risky move. So what I need to do is have my army in Bulgaria support a move over here because that'll counter that move. And then lo and behold, when I enter my moves in, boom, 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 I've countered everything, or I've broken through their lines because I understood what they were thinking intuitively just by looking at how they were playing the game, and I was able to predict their moves and counter it. In press diplomacy, most players try to do that by talking, that they talk, try to find out, get the other person to tell them what their moves are, and then either help them if they're their ally, or attack them if they're enemies. It's never going to happen in gunboat diplomacy. There's no way to find out the other player's intentions by talking to them. You have to read their mind. And that sounds sounds almost magical, like that's a mystic that you can't really read people's minds. And I think the answer is that you can. It's not a magic skill. People are far more predictable and habitual than they imagine that they are. Just like how you can walk into your house and see that somebody unusually, left a bunch of items right by the front door, and you hear something, you know what? I think they must have been in a hurry to go to the bathroom or take a shower or something, because they got through the front door much faster than usual. You, like Sherlock Holmes or detective, you can infer a lot of things about what someone's doing or thinking from little signs in their actions. And a diplomacy board's the same way, where I can see from how this player had the opportunity to move to Mid-Atlantic Ocean, but didn't. Why? What were they thinking? What caused them to decide this way? Was it did they read the situation differently than I did? Are they, what's happening? And you can figure that out. And if you're put the effort in, can pretty reliably understand the game. You can even have a conversation with somebody where you negotiate about who's going to take Belgium just from sending support orders and so on. A student I've been working with, a student of diplomacy that I've been working with recently, was asking for some guidance on how to deal with certain situations that he had screenshotted. He'd taken screenshots of Gunboat diplomacy matches and said, hey, what's the right move in this situation? Did I make the right choice? And I had to say, I have no idea. I don't know what's the context. What did these players do on the preceding, 20 turns that led up to this situation? Because I'm not going to assess what the right move is based on the positions of the pieces, but based on the person who's behind it. And I don't know who that person is just from looking at where their pieces are on the board in 1908. That doesn't really tell me a lot about them. But if I can see what happened every turn, and every time they made a decision, they zigged or zagged, they helped this guy or they attacked this guy, now I understand this person's personality, and I can tell you, this is what you should do in this situation. And that was a breakthrough lesson. Like, you can't just look at the board and expect to know what your moves are. Same with press diplomacy. You would talk. You would try to understand what the other person's intentions are before deciding.
There's a whole history that can tell you what you ought to be doing, because a certain position on the map could mean someone's attacking you, or it could mean they are withdrawing from having previously tried to attack you. At any moment in time, it's impossible to tell what was going on, for sure.
So I think that what attracts me to the game of Gunboat diplomacy are some of those practical things that I talked about earlier that attract other players. It's really easy to find a match. They start quickly. You can find people online. There's not a lot of time commitment. You can play a couple of games at the same time, and it's not really a big deal. So that way you could start 3, and if you start losing in 2 of them, well, this third one I'm doing good, and have at least one game where you're doing pretty well, keep your spirits up. Those are all practical reasons to want to play online Gunboat diplomacy. But it's not limited to just the game in itself. That although I think that Gunboat diplomacy is a fun game that's rewarding to play in its own right, I do think it makes you much, much better at regular diplomacy, sometimes called classic diplomacy or press diplomacy.
Wow, that is something I'm very interested in.
I think that's because although diplomacy is a game that's taking place as a clash of intellects between the players, personalities, a psychological war sometimes it feels like, there's still a board. There's still a board on there with pieces that are moving around, and they can only do so many things. And understanding what the pieces are capable of, not just on a given turn, but down the road, 2 or 3 turns from now, where could this piece be realistically speaking? What kind of moves are risks versus moves that are pretty safe? And press diplomacy, if you've only ever played press diplomacy, that can be kind of hard to figure out, because the players will tell you, oh, I assure you this is a very reasonable move or whatever. But if you play Gunboat diplomacy, you think very differently about what is a safe position or what's a risky position, because you have to figure that on your own. The other players will never tell you what they think you should do or negotiate. You have to do everything kind of brutally by force. And the other thing in Gunboat diplomacy is that you can't rely on other players to tell you what you need to do in order to, say, set up a stalemate line. They can't tell you. So you have to know. You have to know how to form a stalemate line and under what circumstances, and know that in advance, or know how to look it up in the middle of the game. And so if you played Gunboat diplomacy, let's say, you played a while, played a lot of games, seeing something like, let's say, an English army in Ionian Sea, an English fleet in Ionian Sea, That's freakish. That's something that almost never, ever, ever happens in gunboat diplomacy because of how far away it would be to get, et cetera, logistically. That kind of thing doesn't even come up that much in press diplomacy. But the context of seeing that English player approach and get past the stem line, if you saw that taking place in gunboat diplomacy, there's nothing the player can say to communicate or explain what's happening. You just have to think about it. What is the implication of this? Is this good or bad? And for who? And figure that all out on your own, not rely on the other players to give you that information. So when you're playing press diplomacy, after having played dozens of matches of gunboat, you have a strong internal sense of what is the significance of each piece being in each place. Is this advantageous or not? Is this what's realistic? How far can this go? What's dangerous? If Russia asks me I'm Turkey, and Russia asks me, hey, can I move my fleet into Black Sea? Gunboat diplomacy, I'd say that's a disaster. I'm absolutely dead. I'm a dead man if Russia's fleet gets into Black Sea. So from a press game, I know, okay, I would only agree to this if I'm willing to trust this player with my life. That I think, okay, yes, the circumstances call for it. I have to place my complete confidence or I'm dead, or this player really has earned it. Because I would never tolerate that in gunboat diplomacy. So because I have that context, that in a gunboat game with ruthless players, this is intolerable, this is such a big threat to me, I know that in press diplomacy, when the player asks me to tolerate it, that's a big ask. That's not a trivial thing that they're asking me to do because I have that context. Now, you can get that context from playing a bunch of press diplomacy, but you're not going to be able to play 100 press diplomacy matches in 3 years. You could play 100 gunboat games.
In 3 years. I will say, I think I've played about 200 diplomacy games in about 6 years. But no, I think it would have been a lot faster if I'd been playing gunboat games. And I would have probably played a lot more. I mean, I see what you're saying. It sharpens your instincts for what positions are dangerous or relatively safe, and also sort of gives you this sense of what the other players are likely to be thinking based on certain spaces they may be occupying, and what support orders they issue, things like that. It's interesting.
So press diplomacy is an infinitely complex game. It's the limit of your skill is the limit of the human condition. I think if I played diplomacy for the rest of my life, I'm 90 years old on my deathbed, I'll say, if I live 90 years more, I would be 90 years better. It's just that kind of game where anything you know about the human condition could be relevant and could help you to play the game. Gunboat diplomacy is so simplified. It's incredible. It's much simpler. And so it doesn't have that level of depth, but it's not a joke. It is a real game that you can get good at and improve your skills and start consistently beating other players, even good players, once you learn those skills. And those skills, in my opinion, translate to press diplomacy in that you're still playing on the same board, and the pragmatic realities of the board itself are still taking place in a press diplomacy game. So that even though there's so much more in your toolkit of how I can talk to players and negotiate, and I can choose to trust somebody based on what they're saying and make long-term plans, all this stuff is available. But the small-scale tactical stuff is still there. That's still real. And I often coach players to build on that and say, okay, I've got this practical understanding that I'll say, for example, that it's hard for England to solo win, having played an alliance with France early on. That can be hard in gunboat diplomacy because for various practical reasons, you can't really negotiate the French player to leave you in peace, and that makes it hard. So in press diplomacy, that knowledge, I've played a lot of games where I tried to ally the French player and they just backstabbed me. So now I know to ask for things like, hey, French player, I think your fleet in Mid-Atlantic Ocean, that needs to go into Spain or Portugal or something. I'm not going to be your ally if your fleet is in Mid-Atlantic Ocean, because I know that fleet can just move and attack me in one move, be in North Atlantic Ocean or Irish Sea. And right. But if you had not experienced that over and over again, might not occur to you how dangerous that situation can be for that alliance. And so even in a gunboat game, I'll be hard to negotiate that. And so maybe it's hard to put the England-France alliance together. I now understand what tactical changes I may ask for, what positions I may ask the French player to take, so that I then can play the legendary, your Western juggernaut, or whatever you want to call the England-France alliance. It's a strong alliance, but if it's England, you just got to make sure that you're not just the stooge for the French player.
Yeah, I would imagine, especially in Gunboat. I have occasionally looked at your blog, and I know that apparently France is a quite strong player, or quite strong power to play in Gunboat diplomacy. In my experiences with press diplomacy, when I play an Anglo-French alliance, I'd usually rather be England, and that's pretty different from the sounds of it.
I think that's a great topic area to open up, because the balancing of gunboat diplomacy is pretty different, and I'll explain what I mean. In terms of game balance, we're talking about a situation in game design where the players have asymmetrical starting positions, and diplomacy has that in spades. The powers are not just in different starting positions, but they're inherently different based on their geography and how they can build units and so on. But somehow the game design is incredibly balanced. I would say that in press diplomacy, I'm comfortable with any power. They all have their strengths and their weaknesses, and an inherently a feature of diplomacy that balances the game is that the players can plan around any perceived imbalances. If you're concerned that you think that Turkey's much stronger than Italy or Austria, then as Italy or Austria, form an alliance against Turkey. You can work that sort of stuff out. Mm-hmm. In gunboat diplomacy, the players can't communicate in words, so they don't have the ability to communicate their perceptions or intentions in such complex ways. And this changes the game balance significantly. For example, Russia, who's just as good as any other power in classic diplomacy, some people think exceptionally powerful. Maybe Russia is one of the better countries. Russia is absolutely, hands down, the worst power in gunboat diplomacy. How could this be? How could the game be so different? Well, think about it. Russia starts off in this really spread out position with units all over the map. That's very advantageous in press diplomacy, because now every player has a reason to be talking to you and trying to curry some kind of favor. You can influence your way to Scandinavia or whatever. And in the long run, being involved on both halves of the map can make it hard to form a stalemate line against your position if you're trying to win. These are really interesting advantages. But Russia has enormous tactical disadvantages, which is that Russia's spread out position means that Russia has no force concentration. Russia's two starting fleets cannot possibly help in the other direction. The northern fleet can't defend Moscow, and neither can the southern fleet, the one in Sevastopol. So if Russia's attacked early, Russia can be destroyed really fast. Russia only really has like 3 units down in the south and 1 at the north, or 2 and 2 or something like that. And it's just not enough concentration to survive against an early attack. So without a way to negotiate with the other players and give them a reason to tolerate you or to help you out, or, hey, I'll some kind of deal, in gunboat diplomacy, Russia's neighbors just look at Russia as, these are some really easy supply centers for me to get. They'd be really easy to take because Russia's defenses are so weak. And so it's very, very common that Russia never even gets more than 5 supply centers and just debilitated the entire match because there's no way to talk the other players into some kind of arrangement. And there's an inverse situation that goes on with corner powers, that other corner powers, not Russia. Where am I trying to say with this? The corner power concept is less meaningful in gunboat diplomacy because of the striking power imbalances between Russia and, say, England, France, and Turkey. And I want to talk about France and how France's position in gunboat diplomacy is so strong. I think maybe equal to Turkey. Turkey has really strong defense, and France has really strong offense, but they're both not weak in either regard. So France has a position that on the board has a bunch of interlocking territories that require France's neighbors to support each other's moves in order to break through. So in press diplomacy, it's trivial to negotiate that. Hey, will you support my move? Yes, I will. Okay, I believe him. I believe this player. So we support each other's moves and we make our attacks. In gunboat diplomacy, you'll see things like England supports Germany into Belgium, Germany supports England into Belgium, and France walks right in. Well, what are they going to do? Each player, wanted the other one as their ally, but because they couldn't. And so then, okay, no problem. The next turn, England attacks Belgium and Germany attacks Belgium and France remains because neither of them supported the other one's attack. So when you're working with allies in gunboat diplomacy, not only do you have to guess what your enemy is going to do, but you also have to guess what your ally is going to do, adding this whole level of mental complexity to working together. So because of the way France is set up, greatly advantages France in gunboat diplomacy, where even if 2 or 3 of France's neighbors are trying to fight France, they may not be able to do it because they have to support each other's orders at some point. I've played gunboat diplomacy games where I'm France and I'm against England, Germany, Italy. All 3 are attacking me. It's a tournament. These are good players who are trying to win. And it's something like 1908 before they get me below 4 supply centers, because I can just keep making moves and they have to support each other's guesses. Meanwhile, they still have to guess me correctly. If my support hold orders counter their support move orders, I get to live to see another day. Turkey's got a very similar thing going on defensively, where if Turkey's totally surrounded by Austria and Italy working together, or like Russia helping Austria, where Turkey will go down in a few years in a traditional diplomacy game. Mm-hmm. But what about Austria supports Italy to Aegean Sea, Italy supports Austria to Aegean Sea. Meanwhile, Turkey sails right in and continues to advance against players who are trying to work together to fight Turkey. And so this incredibly strong defensive position has diplomatic implications, which is that the players often won't prioritize fighting another power who can defend well. They'll prioritize a power who can be wiped off the map quickly, so they get those supply centers and become stronger. Because when you're using your own units, your support orders are going to work, and you'd much rather be your own ally, so to speak. So like if I'm Germany and I cannibalize Russia and then go on to fight England, I'm fighting England as a real Germany-Russia alliance, or like an equivalent level of power. Whereas if I were Germany and I tried to ally Russia against England, we could mess up. We could keep messing up even if we're trying to work together. So this is a reason why, I think this is super interesting. This dynamic is very disfavorable, or at least for beginners. It ends up really bad for Russia. Austria often gets just attacked immediately by Italy. But in players who are informed, who understand gunboat diplomacy, have read about it, maybe they read my blog, they learn things like, okay, because France has this inherent strength, that means I really do need to attack France early and relentlessly and hope other players do so, because if I don't start now in 1901, I may never have this opportunity down the road. And so over time, like on web diplomacy, where a lot of players do read my blog, I think, because that's where I played most of my matches, that's where my online career got started. On web diplomacy, a lot of gunboat players, they'll haul off and attack France immediately, and they do not let off their foot off of France until France has debilitated, because this is what I've advised. I said, yes, do that. Do it. Take France down, or you could be in trouble later on. So I point that out to say that there are players who may listen to this and say, France is terrible. I get destroyed every time. It's not because France is weak. It's because the players are trying to counteract the strength of France. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the metagame in press diplomacy has its effect too, but it's much more muted. I mean, there's an understanding that a couple of the strongest countries are France, Russia, and Germany, probably, just based on like old numbers about which country was most likely to win. But nobody attacks France, Germany, or Russia based on those numbers, because every game is different in press diplomacy. There's no consistency. France could get really destroyed really quickly if the alliances just happen to go against it, and the same applies to the others. But I guess in gunboat, those geographic disparities can be really decisive.
That's exactly true. And the metagame is a concept that's very important to understand in gunboat diplomacy also, because of how the players may not communicate in words. For the benefit of a viewer, the metagame is it's a term of art for board games and video games, referring to your expectation ex ante, like at the very beginning, with no knowledge of the other player, anything about them, what you think they're likely to do based on the habits of the player community at large. I grew up, I played a lot of online shooting games. When I was a teenager, I played maybe hours a day in the summertime. And an example of a metagame concept might be if there's an expectation that players run out and get this powerful weapon right away. Everybody goes for the sniper rifle right at the start. So you might think, okay, I'm going to not even bother because everybody's going to run over there and kill each other, and I'm not even going to be the one to get it. I'm going to go for the second best weapon, even though I know it's the second best because I think I'm likely to get it. That's a metagame that you have. I'm going to apply what I've learned from my experiences and what other players' habits and tendencies are, even though I don't know anything about them, these particular players, and I'm going to try to counter that. And that's very important to gunboat diplomacy because the players are anonymous, and you might only have the barest knowledge of who they might be, like what website you're playing on, a tournament, and who joined the tournament. Web diplomacy has a way for players to like bet invisible money chips. Like, okay, if we had to bet a lot of money chips to play in this game, they must have at least played before, you know, if they won some matches. But that's it. Other than that, you don't really have much to go on. And so you have to choose your moves, especially your starting moves, in anticipation of what you think the other players are likely to do. So, for example, it's extremely common to see both Austria and Russia bouncing Galicia in 1901. Even though negotiating that space as an empty space is pretty common, to the point of almost, I would say it's almost equally likely that they bounce versus that they leave it open in a regular diplomacy game. I don't know, you know, or someone sneaks in. They claim they were going to bounce, not that they left a demilitarized zone, but they sneak in. But in gunboat diplomacy, I would say 95% of the time you're going to see those players bounce. And that's because they anticipate the other player moving to Galicia. I'm Austria. If I think Russia's going to move to Galicia, I need to bounce. I'm Russia. I think Austria's going to move to Galicia. I need to bounce.
And it's such a valuable space. You can't afford to have anybody else take it.
Exactly. And so there are many moves like that you'll see in the opening that are almost a given. Turkey and Russia are extremely likely to bounce in Black Sea, a similar rate, even though in press diplomacy, they oftentimes negotiate to do something different. It's just, what else do you have to go on? I just know that the Russian player is really likely to move, or I know that the Turkish player is really likely to move, so I need to bounce. And it applies not just to opening moves, but to strategic concepts in general. What alliances are likely to form and the significance of those alliances. So, for example, in a well-developed gunboat metagame, where like the players are experienced, it's pretty unlikely to see Italy attack Austria in 1901. Most of the time you're going to see Italy play neutrally, menace France, or even set up to attack Turkey. That's what you're more likely to see. And the reason why that's really common to see, in my opinion, is that Italy can't really develop the wintergreen alliance with Russia. That requires press. They don't border each other. That requires some thoughtful communication. So if Italy attacks Austria early on, Italy maybe going to get some supply centers, but meanwhile, it's going to be a free-for-all as to whether Turkey or Russia get more centers. And a lot of times, Italy just ends up being overpowered by Turkey, or at best, getting stuck with a draw because of Russia's weakness and the inability to coordinate their moves to pin in Turkey. Knowing that trajectory, knowing that, okay, if I attack Austria immediately, that's probably not going to result in a win for me, maybe a draw. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do something else. Okay, so that's likely to happen. So the Austrian player may have a similar anticipation that the Italian player is unlikely to attack me in 1901 and make an opening that's the Balkan Gambit, move Vienna to Galicia, Budapest to Serbia, and Trieste to Albania. And so it's in games that I play, it's quite common to see Italy move Venice to Piedmont and Austria move Trieste to Albania in 1901 immediately de-escalate the region because they're both anticipating the consequences of attacking each other and the benefit of not attacking. Okay, well, there's further implications to that. So if I am Turkey and I know that the likely metagame choices of Italy are to not attack Austria and Austria's is to move everything away from Italy, then that means my best shot at getting a neighbor for an ally is Russia. So maybe attacking Russia and moving my army at Smyrna to Armenia is like not that great of an opening because even though oftentimes attacking Russia is a perfectly great way to begin the match, if I know that that's going to be, if I'm going to be attack Russia at the same time that Italy and Austria alliance gets going, oh, that's going to be a major mistake. So Turkish players are, in these matches, unlikely to open by moving their army to Armenia and attack Russia, and so on and so forth, where all the players have some anticipation of what other players are likely to do, and they're choosing those moves in anticipation. It becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy where like Juggernaut versus Italy and Austria forms match after match, because if you don't do it, you could be the one who gets in trouble. And this metagame is different in different communities. If you're to play on Backstabber or play Diplomacy or a private league of players who organize their games through the Nexus, you're going to see the metagame go in a different direction, because that's a community of players who they know on some level, and they're going to have different expectations of how those players choose their moves.
Right. I understand it's similar with press diplomacy, because within some communities of players, I think the Weasels up in Chicago like to open Turkey moving to Armenia, and regardless of what the diplomatic situation is, and treat that as normal. And to me, that's madness, unless you're just ready to throw everything at Russia. But that's to them, that's just something that Russia should forgive if they end up deciding to work with them, and it's just a different meta.
It's my opinion, understanding the metagame of the community that you're playing with is absolutely essential to succeeding in gunboat diplomacy, because you have nothing else to choose your opening moves on. In press diplomacy, even if the players have wacky ideas about the metagame, they can at least communicate them to you in words, and you have some chance to think about it and respond. You don't have such opportunity in gunboat diplomacy.
Yeah. Sounds like your success or failure could really hinge on how well you understand the community you're participating in with gunboat.
Yes. There are many other hidden depths to psychology that I've learned in gunboat diplomacy that are just interesting in themselves and have some bearing on press diplomacy. For example, earlier I talked about the importance of forming stalemate lines, and how in gunboat diplomacy, you don't get to talk about it. You don't get to send another player a diagram or whatever of the stalemate line that you think that you need to form. They have to just know it. And if the other player doesn't know the stalemate line that you need to form, you lose. They just have to know it. So if I'm playing a gunboat match and I think the best outcome I can get here is a draw, I'm playing for a draw now. I'm not going to be the winner of this game. I need to make sure somebody else doesn't win. That's my goal. And there are two players nearby. One who seems like they might understand how to form a stalemate line, and one who seems like maybe they don't. And so I'm going to destroy that player, the one who seems like they don't understand how to form a stalemate line. I'll do whatever it takes to knock them out of the match, knowing that I will just lose for sure. My loss is guaranteed if I'm trying to form a stalemate line with a player who doesn't understand how to do it or why to do it. I will just lose. So my only hope of ending this match in a draw is taking this player down. And other players who are experienced at gunboat diplomacy make a similar assessment, where they go, all right, it's time to play for a draw. Who seems like they're capable? And telegraphing that information can be quite important to show that you understand that it's time to form a stalemate line and what positions may be required, and signaling with your pieces so that the other player goes, yep, that's a person who understands what to do. I need to leave them alone so that we can form the stalemate line and go take out somebody else who maybe seems less competent. And the reverse situation applies. If I think, yes, this is a game where I can win. I think I could win this game. This guy seems like he knows what he's doing. Probably will know how to form a stalemate line. I'm going to take that player down fast. This player's made some strange orders that reflect that they maybe don't understand everything that's going on in this game. I'll leave them alone. I'll happily let them go, and they think, wow, this player's my ally, never attacking me the entire game. That's really cool. But I just left you alone because you seem like a moron. And sure enough, when the time comes and I need that one center to cross the stalemate line, that player is just not doing anything right. They may not even try to form the stalemate line. And so being able to infer that about a player's capabilities just from seeing how they've moved their pieces and so on, that could be the difference between getting a draw and losing, or winning and getting a draw, and making those choices early on. I've since realized, the same thing applies in press diplomacy, so that if I'm playing a difficult match where I think, the best I can hope for is a draw, then the players I might want to try to work with are players who seem very good, to make sure that we don't mess things up. They don't throw the game in frustration or something like that. Whereas if I think that this is a game where I can win, then helping along a beginner who seems to have no idea what's going on, or bypassing a player who seems indifferent to the outcome of the match, in order to take down the players who may really be capable of stopping me, I appreciated the importance of that, from how it's not going to be decisive in press diplomacy, because a good player can give advice to a bad one, but it still makes a difference. And I learned that it makes a difference from how much it matters in gunboat diplomacy.
Very interesting. Maybe you can tell me some more psychology stuff you learned from gunboat, because I feel like that seems like a rich mine.
I agree. I think that I'll tell you about the technique that I like to use to understand another player. And what I do is I create a little mental model of each of the other players that are in the match. And I refine that model based on what they reveal from their decisions. And then I use that model to make specific predictions of what their movements are going to be, and then choose my moves around those specific predictions, which could either be to attack them or to help them, depending on the circumstances. So at the beginning of the match, that mental model is just based on the metagame. What kind of players are in this match? These are inexperienced, or it's unclear, very good players. Okay, so that's all I have to go on. These players are mixed group. Some are good and some are not so good, and that's all I really have to go on. Okay, well, the first turn reveals something, because the moves that they choose are going to be chosen based around their metagame expectations, or their effort to deviate from it, etc. So, for example, on web diplomacy, I can tell you I have a pretty strong expectation of how every single piece, Austria, Russia, Turkey, will move. Germany, England, and maybe one piece is unclear how Italy is going to move. And France is maybe the one that's the hardest to predict based on the metagame expectation. That seems harder to predict. But like, if I see an Austrian player who doesn't make the Balkan Gambit opening, for whatever deviation they made from that opening, that communicates a great deal about how that player thinks. Was it incompetent, or have they not played a lot of gunboat diplomacy? Are they from a different community? Did they decide to take a risk? Is this just a risky move that's a little weirder than normal? So for example, if I'm playing a match where I know that some of the players are not very experienced, and I see the Austrian player do something like move Trieste to Venice as part of their opening, I think, okay, that's one of the inexperienced players. I bet you last time they got Austria, they got attacked by Italy, and Italy blew them out of the water. And so now they think, what I have to do is, make a defensive opening that way to prevent Italy from attacking me, something like that. And that's now my change. I've now changed my mental model of the Austrian player. Okay, they are one of the weaker players. They're not experienced in gunboat diplomacy. Now I look for signs that that's right. Do they continue to make moves that seem like the moves of an inexperienced player who is frightened of Italy? Is that so? And so, okay, well, I'm going to predict then that they make this build, and let's see. Do they build the way that an inexperienced player frightened of Italy would build? They did. Okay, so there's some confirmation. What will happen in 1902? Well, an inexperienced player that's frightened of Italy would move these two armies here, would move this fleet this way, and let's see. That's my prediction. I make a specific prediction as to how they would move. Then when the turn goes by and I see, yes, they moved every single piece exactly as I predicted. I go, this is it. I've got them pegged. This is definitely this player, and I feel very confident that I'm going to predict maybe everything they do. I would say this is a player's probably not be able to form a stalemate line. By 1902, I've got that in mind. And so if I feel like I'm on a trajectory towards winning, that's a player I'm going to leave alone. If I'm on a trajectory towards a draw, that's a player who I'm going to wipe out. I figured this out. But let's say it's not true, or my prediction turns out to be not right. I predicted this, and they did a bunch of things that were inconsistent with that prediction. Okay, why? What did they do? What would someone have been thinking in order to reach that decision? What kind of person would decide to do this type of move, and refine my mental model. Okay, actually, this player's actually quite experienced, but why did they make that weird metagame opening? Okay, well, there's two possible interpretations. One, they just wanted to confuse everybody about who they were, that they might have been sandbagging. They might have been faking that they were not so good in order to confuse everybody into making a different strategic choice. Or they're like some kind of, maybe they're really good, but from a different community. They mostly play press diplomacy, or they're from a different gunboat group. And so, okay, I know that there was somebody here. So if I have some knowledge of who the specific people are that signed up for the match, by 1902 or 1903, I might be able to say who they are specifically, know which person, what their name is, because their moves give away information that you can use like a game of Clue, like checking off the boxes. Okay, it's not the knife, it's not the rope, or whatever. Not this, it must be the gun, that must be that guy from play diplomacy, because that would make sense if you were a play diplomacy kind of person. Really, it is possible to make those kind of inferences, because every decision point communicates the thought process. There was 700 possible move sets the player could have chosen from, and they chose that one. And there was some kind of some thought process. Even if the thought process was, I only have 5 minutes, I don't know, that's what I'm entering. That's a thought process, and that can be given away by what the players did.
And if that was their thought process, that might repeat. Like they might be somebody who's constantly pressed for time because they're just not, they didn't realize how a diplomacy game worked. They didn't know if it would take this much time. They think if it's gunboat, I shouldn't be taking much time thinking about my moves. I think the mental models thing is something I've also found very useful in press diplomacy, because there are patterns of behavior and ways of communicating, ways of moving that can tell you a lot about what someone's likely future intentions are years out before they make really substantial steps toward whatever thing they're doing. In press diplomacy, I don't find it's all that. I don't find it's terribly uncommon for Italy to go to Piedmont, but I wouldn't say it's the norm. If Italy does go to Piedmont, I think that that probably tells me something, especially if they do that and leave Venice vacant. And Italy quite often will do something like Venice holds, Rome Apulia, Naples to Ionian. It's a boring Italian opening, but it's a very common opening because a lot of people will not see a better option. And if you don't have any allies and you are having trouble getting a running start in the game, that might even be your best option. But what can you say from that? This person is probably planning to convoy to Tunis. Why are they convoying to Tunis? They're going to attack Turkey. Why are they going to attack Turkey? They're hoping to work with Austria and or Russia. And they're an enemy of Turkey, and that's an important thing. And they're not an enemy of France right now, until and unless something in the diplomatic situation changes. You can't be certain of that early on, because having an army in Tunis, maybe it might have some utility against France, although having a fleet in Tunis is probably better. But you can tell that just from those moves, just from that those circumstances. I think the mental model thing is probably adaptable to many different games and life situations as well. What would it mean if I did this? What are my intentions? What kind of thought process is going through my mind if I did this? We all have empathy, so it's a way of applying it.
For gunboat diplomacy, I have developed a theoretical understanding of how players choose their moves that I have found very helpful to me in developing my mental model and in making specific predictions of the players' moves. I have been working on it for a long time to find a way to explain it in a concrete manner, because I really just choose my moves based on intuition. And it's hard to put it into words. But I've been working on it for a long time because I've been coaching players for some years now. And I have started hinting at this in my writing, and I plan to publish something hopefully next year that will be like a comprehensive explanation. But I'd like to talk to you about it now, since I think it's germane to the conversation. So I learned a lot about the game theory from independent game designer David Sirlin. We're not personally acquainted, but I've followed his work for years, buy almost all his board games on Kickstarter. And he comes from the fighting video game community. And a lot of the game concepts that he learned from those video games are incorporated into the board games that he makes. And in a fighting video game, like a tournament fighter, let's say like Street Fighter or Super Smash Brothers or Dragon Ball Fighters, whatever, games like that, the players are entering their moves in effect simultaneously. Like they're pretty much simultaneously entering their moves because it's just so fast. You don't actually have the ability to react to a specific entry by the other player. So if you issue an attack on me, I need to be holding down the block button at the time that you make the attack in order to block it. And so on, for all the different combinations of moves. Everything in a fighting video game can be countered by something else. If it's a well-designed game, it'll be fair. But you have to know what your opponent is doing at the time that they're hitting their buttons. If you watch like a video of the elite players playing for the world championship, you'll see them do things like one player will enter in the correct button press, something like 99 times in a row. How can that be? I mean, they're basically playing rock, paper, scissors. I mean, there's only so many moves you can make in this fighting video game. How can you correctly guess the other person's moves? Well, the answer is that the pace of the game is so fast that the players are they're not randomizing their moves even as much as they might try. They're relying on their habits. And so if you were the player who has I got into their head, you know how their habits work or how they think about the game, you can counter their every move sometimes. And to understand how this works, David Sirlin explained the concept of a Yomi level. I'll explain what I mean. Yomi is a Japanese word referring to mind reading. Like it means like mind reading, is my understanding of this word. And this is obviously not magical mind reading, but get in the other player's head. Right? I own you. I know everything, how you think. And a Yomi level is the method of countering that the other player is using to decide their moves. So, for example, let's say that we're in a fighting video game, and my character has these really powerful attacks. My character is an attacking character, big fists, that I attack with. And so what I want to do is press the button that attacks with the fist. That's my best move. And that's Yomi level 0. As in, I'm not even trying to counter what the other player is doing. I'm just doing what I think is my favorite or best move. So the other player may be applying some Yomi, like, all right, I know that guy just loves to use the fist attack. That's what that guy does. So I'm gonna begin by blocking, even though block is not really that doesn't even really get me anywhere. Most of the time, it's not my best move, but it will beat that attack. So I need to block, and that'll be Yomi level 1, countering what you think the other player is going to do. Okay. So maybe I'm a rather more advanced big fists guy player than you took me for. And I anticipate that you're going to begin the match by blocking. So I'm going to begin the match by grappling, the move, whatever, that counters blocks. Even though the grapple is not very good, it doesn't really do much damage, whatever, but it does beat that block. And that's Yomi level 2. That I am anticipating that you're anticipating what I'm going to do, so I do something that doesn't even make any sense in order to stop you from reading me. And these are the Yomi levels. Yomi level 0 is I'm just doing my obvious good action that my character or in diplomacy that my country logically wants to do, just the default moves. And Yomi level 1 is anticipating the other player's moves and trying to counter those somehow. And Yomi level 2 is doing something unpredictable on purpose to stop the other players from trying to counter you, a counter to their counter. And in most diplomacy situations, the tactical situation that exists, the players are able to, those Yomi levels exist. And I'll give a specific example that I think helps illuminate this concept. Let's say, without knowing much else about the board, don't worry about like diplomacy or strategy, I'm just talking about the Yomi. That Germany's got an army in Prussia and Silesia, and Russia's got an army in Warsaw and Moscow. And Germany's got some other third army in Munich or Berlin that's not in position. Right. There is a Yomi level 0 move for Germany. I'm going to move one of my armies to Warsaw and support it with the other, and that maximizes my chances of getting Warsaw. If Russia does anything at all other than support hold Warsaw, Warsaw is mine, and I will make the capture. I don't have to think any further. I'm not trying to counter Russia's moves. I'm just making the obvious move for me. If Russia doesn't counter it, I succeed. So as Russia, you can look at that board and go, ooh, you know, Germany's got this really obvious attack, really obvious here. You know, makes the supported move on Warsaw. It'll be a capture. I won't really be able to get it back. You know, that's a pretty strong move, you know, because Germany's going to backfill with that third army. It's going to be locked down. Okay, so what I need to do, what I want to do is counter it. With my Yomi level 1 move, I'm going to have Moscow support hold Warsaw, which doesn't inherently get me anything. I don't gain anything by having Moscow support hold Warsaw. That move only makes sense if I'm trying to counter an anticipated attack from Germany. But Germany has a Yomi level 2 move. Germany can move Prussia to Livonia, Silesia to Prussia, and the army of Munich or Berlin to Silesia to line up for a future attack.
Yes. So
which would be
moving, increasing levels from playing the board to more and more playing the other players. Sorry. But
yes. Oh, no problem. You follow along precisely. Russia has a Yomi level 2 move here as well. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what it is?
It's to block the move to Livonia.
That's right. But to do that, Russia has to give up defending Warsaw.
Yeah, that's a mighty risk. If Russia isn't certain about Germany's state of mind, then Russia could be throwing away Warsaw.
Because if Germany makes the Yomi level 0 move and Russia does anything else, Russia loses Warsaw and is a very bad position. That's a very simple board state, but these concepts can be applied to almost any tactical situation, where you can analyze and say, okay, what's the obvious move that a player would want to do to advance their position? What's the counter move to that? And then what are these increasing levels of counters that players can do? So this is very helpful in getting a read on the other player's psychology, because you'll find that many players invariably execute Yomi level 0 moves. They make no effort to counter anticipated moves from the other player, or like maybe a little bit, like if it's just very obvious. Yeah. And so having never seen the player do advanced counters or like complex counters, I can predict that they won't. They won't make those moves. Even though theoretically they could counter this attack I'm trying to make with this very complex configuration. I go, but they won't. They never do those moves. They never do these complex counters. So I feel very confident that I'm going to get away with it. So something like seeing a player play a Yomi level 2 move ever at any point in the match tells you an incredible volume about that player's experience and skill level. Say that move only makes sense if they're trying to counter a move that's a counter to my move. So let's say I'm England or France or whatever, and I'm watching this fight between Germany and Russia. I'm not participating in it. I'm just watching it. But I see Russia bounce Moscow and Warsaw off of each other in Livonia. No matter what happens from that point on, or what was the outcome of the fight, I know that Russian player is extremely good. They have played a lot of diplomacy for that move to even make sense at all. They have to have played a significant amount of diplomacy, and I now know that about the player.
Yeah,
I'll expect future moves like that if the situation calls for it.
You're gauging the other player's level of sophistication. Very, very valuable, especially because a lot of the games that people play are anonymous, regardless of whether it's press or gunboat. I mean, you don't necessarily go in with foreknowledge of the players. And ideally, we never have foreknowledge of the players. That's how the game's really supposed to be. So, yeah, that's a useful trick for being able to figure out the experience level of the person you're dealing with and how much thought they're putting into it. Because if you as England, having watched that fight between Germany and Russia, are later in a position where you have to attack Russia, or you want to attack Russia, you now have this extra level of foresight that you can use to anticipate what their counters to your moves might be.
Yes.
Although, the freaky thing, I think, is when you start to get to the point where players are anticipating that someone will anticipate that they anticipated, and they just do the Yomi level 0 move because they know that somebody's going to second guess them, and that Germany's going to try his luck and just support himself into Warsaw. But
if you're playing diplomacy at a high level, I think it is valuable. Another use of the Yomi level concept is to appreciate the tendencies that you're signaling to other players, and to either consciously choose moves from different Yomi levels from time to time, just to keep the other players uncertain about how you think. To go like, man, what I really want to do here is support hold Warsaw, but I always do that, and even if it means losing, I don't want to communicate that I'm so predictable or be so predictable. And sometimes I'm going to throw something in there that's maybe not what I usually instinctually do, just to get the other players not understanding how I think. And you can also do, so that's an offensive purpose of this, which is you're anticipating that other players are trying to predict you. How can I throw them off? Well, I can vary my method over time. Another is to seem predictable for a long time to get the other players complacent, and to choose, let's say, Yomi level 0 moves over and over again for as long as possible. Then when the situation starts looking good and you go for a solo win, reveal the full extent of your tactical capabilities only now that it's too late. And so the players have this completely wrong read about what your capabilities are and how you think, because you spent the last 10 years playing like a predictable, boring person, and now you're making all these crazy moves left and right that you're trying to go for a solo win. In the match, for example, the match Media Wars, which was a match that I played with many other diplomacy content producers, or 6 other diplomacy content producers, and that we all made some content based on the match. A comment that I thought was very interesting and I liked from one of my rivals that made it to the end and stopped me from winning, but it was kind of a close thing, that the player who they experienced in the early and the middle game felt like a completely different person than the one that they experienced during endgame when I was trying to go for a win. And that's because I had deliberately altered not just my press style as the match developed, but also the methods that I was using to decide my moves. So that way, when I came to endgame, the other players wouldn't understand how I think. Does that make sense?
Yes. That is, that's very interesting. And, probably something I can learn from, because I myself have a very distinctive style of play and press, to the point where in anonymous games, people who have played with me before sometimes guess who I am. It doesn't mean they can stop me, but it is, I can be somewhat predictable in that way. There's a steadiness. Like I will, because I usually am pretty consistently just trying to make the best decisions I can, to be as persuasive as I can, to do things as best as possible. But what you're talking about is would be a powerful technique to essentially kind of erase or suppress part of one's identity for part of the match in order to give a different impression of what sort of player you are. That's something I think I think that this is a good way of thinking about it, because I certainly have had trouble disguising who I am in anonymous games.
To elaborate on this idea, and to further rely on the writings of game designer David Sirlin, who I guess I'm touting left and right in this conversation, he has some writings about player archetypes and the styles of play that they bring to a game. For example, the turtle, a player who will take almost no risks, but is relentless and like very difficult to defeat, and by sheer attrition, they may be able to wear down opponents, and so on and so on and so on. There's all these different player archetypes that they might approach a game. And diplomacy, that's mostly for fighting games, but in diplomacy, you got these player archetypes. You can kind of tell, like, oh yeah, that's a player who is like trying not to make any enemies. They'll do what I'll be everybody's friend, and I'll wait for someone else to strike the first blow, and whatever, that kind of player, and so on. Different personalities that they bring. And the insight that I learned from Sirlin's writings that I have applied to diplomacy is that aspiring to a style like this, or trying to hone the style, although it can serve you well to get very good at the style that you use, is not necessarily the best, because there is a style of play that's called for in different circumstances. And the best style of play is one that he called the one true style. The player who is capable of every style of play, capable of them all, and chooses the one that will win in the circumstances of that particular match, or even change it over time as the match goes on. And that is the style of playing diplomacy that I aspire to for myself. I don't try to be, oh, I'm the smooth talking player, or I'm the tactician and I always think things through. No, I want to be able to do all that stuff. But then as the circumstances of the match change, or I find myself against players who I think, a certain method of play is going to, get them to be my ally or defeat them somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that I've mastered this. I'm not in any sense claiming to be a chameleon master of every play style, but I aspire to that and I work towards it, because I think that is the most advantageous, or the best, whatever, the most dangerous. As a diplomacy player, to say that I can play in whatever style seems advantageous for me in this match on this turn, and then I can change to another one in another match if that seems like the way to go, or even as the match develops, maybe I need to change to a different style. Oh, this one's not working for me, I'm going to change to another one.
That does sound like the most advantageous way to be able to play. It sounds like something from the Book of Five Rings or something. I'm not sure. Miyamoto Musashi says that you should adopt the style, the one true style, which is to, know all the different methods. And it's
oh, I'm sure that terminology Serlin uses adapted from the Book of Five Rings.
Very possible.
Oh, I'm very confident. I mean, the fellow likes Japanese fighting video games. I'm sure he is familiar with that writing.
But that's a very interesting point. And, I think I have... it's interesting. I've been fairly successful at playing press diplomacy for a long time. In fact, my first 2 games I soloed. But I've also consistently found that there are a few players who play in a certain way that will cause them to consistently beat me. And I can't help but think it's something to do with being stuck in my own sort of rut, in my own sort of style of play that might function very well for the game in general, against most players, against the average player. But someone who uses a certain particular style will win out over me like rock and paper. I'm just like, I don't understand. How is this piece of paper beating me? But there you go. So this is definitely something to bear in mind. I think this is something that expert diplomacy players should think about, should give some real consideration to, whether or not you can find different ways of achieving results, different ways of playing that involve different kinds of communication, different amounts of communication, different kinds of moves, different Yomi levels. I think that's a very interesting idea. Maybe that's the kind of thing that could take someone who is in the top 10-15% of press diplomacy players or gunboat players to the next level above where they currently are.
I agree with that. I think that understanding that that's possible and desirable is not intuitive to everybody. And that's a concept that doesn't just apply to diplomacy, but any strategy game out there, that like getting really, really, really good at one approach has a limit. It will get you somewhere, but it may not necessarily get you all the way. It may not make you the very best. And so getting outside your comfort zone and learning some new ways, when you talk about diplomacy, it may not even be new ways of playing. It may feel like new ways of being. Because your personality is such a large component of how people approach the game. That there's little techniques that you can use to wade yourself into a situation like that. For example, I've been an advocate of the it's like, I don't really call it, like it's a social technique. It could be used in sales or anything else, of mirroring. Where you consciously try to imitate the other person who you are communicating with, that they may, most people have a pretty good opinion of how they speak and act. And if you copy it unconsciously, they'll see themselves in you and go, this person's pretty reasonable. This person's respectful and charming. And you don't have to understand anything about why they act the way they do. If you just start copying it, there's a good chance that it'll make a good impression. And that's something you can do in diplomacy. You know, the other player begins the match with their press is really concerned about this tactical stuff, and they're using these abbreviations and this way of describing their orders. And they always throw a joke in at the end. Okay, so I can do that too. I can use the same abbreviations that they're using. I can get down to business, but throw a joke in at the end and meet them where they are. And then they may make a good impression on the player. It usually gets you somewhere. I mean, you can't go wrong trying to charm somebody, but that's a simple technique, easy to do, that causes you to act differently than maybe you would normally would. And so once you make it your habit to say, I'm going to try deliberately mirroring some players that I play with in order to develop, to charm them, just be charming. And now having done that for a while, I'm starting to feel comfortable adopting a different persona or a different press style because I've been doing it. So now maybe instead of just copying the other person, I'm gonna use one of these other styles that I've learned from my experiences that I think is necessary in this situation or whatever, advantageous for some reason. But I've learned it now from those practice experiences.
It's interesting. You know, I've occasionally tried a little bit of mirroring, but I usually do it for like only a little while in the communications before I sort of automatically revert back to my normal style. I actually have a video that's going to come out that's going to mention the mirroring concept because it's about building rapport. But I think that's an interesting point, that you can use that kind of, you can look at other people's styles in that way while you're trying to mirror and to establish a relationship there, and look at that as a way of changing your own game up beyond that moment that's required to just talk to someone.
I'll give an example that may add to the appeal of this of learning these skills. In diplomacy, most players who've been around the block have heard the concept of a Care Bear, and that terminology shows you that our player base is a lot older than your typical gaming group, since that's like from 80s pop culture. But a Care Bear is a player who's deliberately playing for draws, or at the very least is just not interested in attacking their main ally, and we'll take that where it goes. And these players exist. There are players who think that, like, that's really the fun in diplomacy, and they enjoy that it's a game where people backstab left and right, but I don't. I never do, or whatever the case is. And I've played with these players plenty of times, and I now, from my experiences, I understand how they think and how they talk and communicate and act, and how a Care Bear player approaches diplomacy, genuine Care Bear player. So because I know that, or I think I know that anyway, I have an opinion that I think I know that, I know how to approach the game as one when the time calls for it. That, like, you know what, I really think this player who's my neighbor is a Care Bear or close to it, and I bet you if I put on my Care Bear suit that we're going to have an incredible alliance going from the start. And because a true Care Bear alliance can be devastating, because they risk everything on their ally and attack everyone, and it can be really, those are interesting matches to be sure. And wear that Care Bear suit for as long as I feel that it's advantageous. But if the moment comes where I think, all right, my ally has outlived their usefulness, it's time to go for the win, backstab. Turns out I was not a Care Bear. I'm not. I play for wins, don't play for draws. No criticism of people who feel the game is different. It's just not how I play. But because I learned that, I now have this tool that if I think the situation calls for it, I can impersonate a Care Bear or be a fake Care Bear. I think I called on my blog a Scare Bear one time.
It sounds like something you'd see on Halloween.
Yeah, exactly. But the idea being that I'm not really a Care Bear, but everything you see and everything you hear is consistent with being one. There's nothing that you'll see or hear that's to the contrary until it's too late. Very advantageous to be able to do that if you can.
Sounds very powerful. You can send me your notes on how to imitate a Care Bear.
That sounds like a great piece, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, you should write that. You should write a blog post about that. I think that would be great. I should probably like try to figure that out myself and do a video on it if I can figure it out. That sounds like a very useful tool. Thank you for giving all this insight in this conversation, Blake. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with the audience during this chat?
If you haven't played Gunboat Diplomacy before, or you had maybe got a bad impression from playing a few times, I suggest giving it another try, or giving it a try for the first time. And play a couple of games before making your opinion, because I think that there is a lot of depth. I think it's a very interesting game. I think it's worth the small amount of time it takes to play it. And I also recommend, I specifically recommend trying to play Gunboat Diplomacy on one of the websites that keeps track of players' rankings, such as Web Diplomacy or Play Diplomacy. There's others. Because then the players may actually try to win and finish the match and so on. If you play a pickup game of Gunboat Diplomacy on like Backstabber, which has a great interface, but the player base doesn't necessarily take the matches very seriously, you may not have as good of a time as I'm describing. I'm saying, oh, it'll be really fun. So pick a website that's got players with ranks, that may take the match seriously, and join some matches, and I think you'll have a good time. I say give it a try.
All right. Thank you, Blake. It's been a pleasure chatting. I feel like I'm probably going to want to have you back on my channel at some point in the future.
Well, I welcome the opportunity. This has been a great conversation. I've had a good time.
Thank you. Me too. I hope you liked this. And if so, I hope you'll like and I hope you'll subscribe. Those things make the channel stronger, give me extra motivation to continue, and help make sure that other people are directed by YouTube's algorithms to this channel. And please comment below with who else you think I might want to interview for the Florida Man Diplomacy channel. Until next time, Florida Man out.